The stars looked different here in the Kronos sector, and Captain Jake Morrison could feel the weight of being so far from home pressing down on his shoulders as he stood on the bridge of the UES Defiance, watching the endless void through the main viewing screen. 8 months they had been traveling through space that no human had ever seen before, and every day took them further from Earth and deeper into the unknown regions that their long-range sensors had detected. From the edge of Human Space Chief Engineer Lisa Kane walked up behind him holding a datapad with the latest reports from the engine room, and her face showed the same mix of excitement and worry that had been on everyone's face since they left the Sol system. "Quantum drive is running perfectly, Captain, and we have enough fuel to keep going for another 6 months. If we need to, but the crew is getting restless being this far from home." Morrison nodded and looked around the bridge at his crew of 800 who had volunteered for this mission, knowing they might never see Earth again, because someone had to be the first to reach out and see what was waiting for humanity among the stars. Lieutenant Sam Carter was bent over his communications console, trying to clean up some strange signals they had been picking up for the past week, and the patterns looked almost like they might be artificial rather than natural. Stellar Phenomena Tactical Officer Ryan Brooks was running diagnostics on their weapon systems, which had never been tested in real combat because humanity had only fought itself and never faced an alien enemy that might have completely different technology. Navigation Officer Paul Rodriguez called out from his station that they were approaching the coordinates where the signals seemed to be strongest, and he was already preparing to drop out of hyperspace to investigate what they might find there. Dr. Amy Foster stood near the science station analyzing everything there. Sensors could tell them about this region of space and making notes about star systems that showed signs of having planets that could support life. Commander Helen Price was reviewing the first contact protocols they had spent months preparing, even though no one really knew what they would encounter or whether the aliens would be friendly or hostile to humans. The Defiance was the most advanced ship humanity had ever built, with experimental shielding technology that used controlled fusion reactions to create energy barriers and weapons that could punch holes through asteroids. But no one knew how it would perform against alien technology. Morrison had been chosen to lead this mission because of his experience exploring the outer edges of human space and his reputation for staying calm under pressure, but nothing had prepared him for the responsibility of representing all of humanity to whatever they might encounter. Bridge fell silent as Rodriguez announced they were ready to drop out of hyperspace, and Morrison gave the order, knowing that whatever happened next would change the course of human history forever. Space twisted around them as the quantum drive shut down, and suddenly they were floating in normal space, surrounded by something no human had ever seen before, which was a massive fleet of alien warships arranged in perfect formation. The enemy vessels were enormous compared to the Defiance, with some of them stretching over 12 kilometers long and covered in weapons that could probably destroy entire cities, and they all had the same angular design that looked like they were built for war rather than exploration. Admiral Zethker stood on the command deck of his flagship watching. His tactical display showed the sudden appearance of an unknown vessel that had somehow materialized in the middle of his fleet without any warning from his sensors. For 3,000 years, the Galactic Empire had ruled this region of space, crushing any species that dared to resist their expansion, and Zethker had never encountered a situation where an alien ship appeared without permission in Imperial territory. The human vessel looked tiny compared to his dreadnoughts, and its design was unlike anything in the Imperial database, with smooth curves instead of the sharp angles that most species used for their military ships. His communications officer reported that the alien ship was broadcasting some kind of signal, but the translation computers were having trouble understanding the language because it contained concepts that did not exist in Imperial vocabulary. Zethker assumed this was either a scout ship from some primitive civilization that had stumbled into his patrol area, or perhaps a smuggler who had made a navigation error and would surrender immediately when they realized their mistake, ordered his communications officer to send the standard surrender demand that had worked on every species they had encountered for the past millennium and expected the aliens to comply within seconds. Back on the Defiance, Carter was working frantically to establish communication with the alien fleet while Morrison tried to process the fact that they had found not just intelligent life, but an entire military force that seemed to be patrolling this region of space. Translation computers finally managed to decode the alien message, and it was a demand for immediate surrender with threats of destruction if they did not comply. Within 60 seconds, Morrison looked at his crew and realized they were facing the first real test of humanity, ability to survive in a galaxy that might be filled with hostile civilizations that had been fighting each other for thousands of years. Price stepped forward and suggested they try to establish diplomatic contact by explaining that they are explorers from Earth seeking peaceful relations with other intelligent species. Brooks reported that his sensors were detecting massive energy readings from the alien weapons, which appeared to be some kind of plasma technology that could probably melt through most known materials. Kane checked their defensive systems and confirmed that their experimental shielding was operating at full power and should be able to absorb significant amounts of energy, but had never been tested against alien weapons. Foster was analyzing the alien ship designs and noted that they seemed to be built for intimidation and overwhelming firepower rather than speed or maneuverability, which suggested these aliens relied on brute force rather than tactical skill. Rodriguez plotted escape routes in case they needed to retreat quickly, but realized they were completely surrounded and outnumbered by more than 200 to 1, which made their situation extremely dangerous. The 60-second deadline was approaching, and Morrison had to make a decision that would affect not just his crew, but potentially all of humanity, because these aliens might have the technology to track them back to Earth. He chose diplomacy over aggression and ordered Price to send a response explaining that they were peaceful explorers who had come seeking knowledge and friendship rather than conquest or conflict. The message included basic information about human civilization and their desire to learn about other species while sharing their own knowledge and technology for mutual benefit. Sithkar received the human response and was confused by concepts like democracy and individual rights that had no equivalent in imperial society, with a strong ruled over the weak without question. He interpreted the human message as a sign of weakness and decided to demonstrate imperial power by ordering a measured attack designed to disable the alien vessel without destroying it completely. Morrison watched the alien weapons charging and knew that humanity was about to face its first real test in the vast and dangerous galaxy that lay beyond their small corner of space. The next few minutes would determine whether humans could survive among the stars, or whether they would become just another conquered species in the endless expansion of an empire that had never known defeat. Admiral Zethker had conquered 17 different star systems during his career, and never once had he encountered a species that could withstand even a basic imperial bombardment. So he ordered 60 plasma cannons from his nearest dreadnought to fire a warning shot that would demonstrate the futility of resistance. The energy beams lanced across space, creating brilliant streaks of light that converged on the small human vessel, and everyone on both sides watched to see what would happen. When alien technology met imperial firepower for the first time, Captain Morrison gripped the arms of his command chair as the plasma barrage struck their shields, and the entire ship shook slightly, but the defensive systems held without even showing signs of strain or overload. King looked at her engineering displays in amazement because the fusion-based shielding had absorbed the entire attack and converted the energy into their power grid, actually making their systems stronger rather than weaker. Brooks announced that their shields had not dropped even 1%, and the alien Weapons appeared to be using technology that was centuries behind human defensive capabilities. Imperial gunners checked their weapons systems 3 times, thinking there must have been a malfunction, because nothing could survive a direct hit from 60 plasma cannons without taking at least some damage. Zethkar stared at his tactical screen, showing the human ship completely undamaged and floating peacefully in space, as if the most powerful weapons in his fleet had done nothing more than tickle their hull communications from other Imperial ships. Began flooding his command center, with officers demanding explanations for how a primitive alien vessel could withstand weapons that had reduced entire cities to molten slag. Carter intercepted dozens of alien transmissions, and the translation computers were working overtime to decode messages that seemed to express confusion, fear, and growing anger at their inability to damage the human ship. Price realized they were dealing with a civilization that had probably never encountered effective resistance, and suggested they use this opportunity to demonstrate human intentions were peaceful rather than hostile. Foster analyzed the alien communication patterns and determined they were looking at a rigidly hierarchical society where questioning orders was probably punishable by death, and flexibility was seen as weakness. Rodriguez studied the enemy fleet formations and reported they were designed for intimidation rather than tactical efficiency, with the largest ships in front and smaller vessels arranged to create maximum visual impact. Morrison knew they had gained a temporary advantage, but realized the aliens would probably escalate their attacks until they found something that could penetrate human defenses, or decided to retreat and bring reinforcements. The Admiral was facing a crisis unlike anything in his long military career, because Imperial doctrine demanded that all species either submit immediately or be destroyed, and there was no precedent for dealing with equals. He decided to order his entire fleet to fire, simultaneously believing that if 60 cannons could not damage the alien ship, then perhaps 1,000 cannons firing together would overwhelm their defensive systems. The command went out across the Imperial formation, and every weapon that could target the human vessel began charging their plasma arrays, while gunners made final adjustments to ensure maximum accuracy. Morrison called his senior staff together for an emergency meeting, knowing they had perhaps minutes before facing the combined firepower of an entire alien fleet that seemed determined to destroy them. Kane reported that their shields could probably absorb much more punishment, but eventually even fusion-based defensive systems would reach their limits if the aliens kept increasing their firepower. Brooks suggested they demonstrate human offensive capabilities by targeting one of the alien ships, but Morrison was reluctant to escalate the situation by attacking first, even in self-defense. Price argued that showing restraint might be interpreted as weakness by a military culture that seemed to respect only strength, and suggested they needed to establish their credibility as equals rather than victims. Foster warned that destroying alien ships might trigger a larger conflict, and recommended they find a way to disable rather than destroy enemy vessels to show they were not interested in conquest. Rodriguez calculated firing solutions for the alien fleet and noted that their formations made them vulnerable to attacks from multiple angles, but also meant any human offensive action would be seen by hundreds of witnesses. The Imperial weapons finished charging, and Zethkar gave the order to fire everything they had at the small alien vessel that had somehow resisted the might of the Galactic Empire. Nearly 1,000 plasma beams converged on the Defiance, creating a light show so brilliant it could be seen from neighboring star systems, and the energy release was equivalent to a small star going supernova. Morrison and his crew watched their shields absorb an amount of energy that could have powered Earth for several years, while their defensive systems continued operating as if nothing unusual was happening. When the bombardment ended, the human ship emerged completely unscathed, with its hull gleaming as if it had just left the shipyard, and its weapon system still powered down to show they had no aggressive intentions. The silence that followed was deafening as hundreds of Imperial officers tried to process the fact that their most powerful weapons had accomplished absolutely nothing against alien technology. They did not understand Zethkar found himself in an impossible situation because retreating would mean admitting defeat and probably cost him his life, while continuing to attack seemed pointless if their weapons could not even scratch the enemy whole. Morrison realized they had reached a critical moment where they could either try to establish peaceful relations or prepare for a war that might eventually reach Earth. If these aliens had the technology to track human ships, he decided to send another diplomatic message, but this time addressed to the entire alien fleet rather than just their commander, and included more detailed information about human civilization and technology. Price crafted a message explaining that humanity had recently developed faster than light travel and was exploring the galaxy seeking knowledge, friendship, and cultural exchange with other intelligent species. The transmission included basic information about Earth democracy, human rights, and the scientific method, along with offers to share medical and agricultural technology that could benefit both civilizations. Carter broadcast the message on all frequencies and monitored alien communications to see how different ships in their fleet would respond to the idea of cooperation rather than conquest. Foster added detailed scientific data about human biology and psychology to show they were dealing with a species that preferred negotiation over warfare, but was capable of defending itself when necessary. Brooks kept their weapons powered down, but ready, knowing they might need to demonstrate human offensive capabilities if diplomacy failed, and the aliens decided to escalate further. The Imperial fleet remained frozen in formation as hundreds of ship commanders waited for orders from an admiral who was struggling to understand how his entire worldview had been challenged by a single alien vessel. Some of the younger officers began questioning whether Imperial doctrine was correct in assuming all species were inferior, and whether there might be value in learning from civilizations that had different approaches to technology. And Zethkar realized he was facing not just a military challenge, but a philosophical crisis that could undermine the very foundations of the Empire if word spread that humans could resist Imperial power and offer alternatives to conquest. Morrison waited for a response, knowing that the next few hours would determine whether humanity had found potential allies among the stars or had made enemies of a civilization that controlled vast regions of the galaxy. The Defiance continued floating peacefully in the center of the Imperial formation, like a small island of calm in an ocean of confused and increasingly desperate alien warships that had never encountered anything they could not destroy. Captain Morrison called his senior staff to the conference room, knowing they needed to discuss their options carefully because every decision they made could affect the future relationship between humanity and this alien empire that seemed to control vast regions of space. Commander Price sat down at the table and immediately began reviewing the diplomatic protocols they had prepared during their long journey, but none of their plans had anticipated encountering a civilization that seemed incapable of understanding concepts like peaceful coexistence. Chief Engineer Kane pulled up the technical specifications for their quantum torpedoes, which had originally been designed for asteroid mining operations, but could potentially be modified for use against alien ships if diplomacy failed. Tactical Officer Ryan Brooks spread out tactical displays showing the positions of every ship in the alien fleet, and noted they were arranged in formations that prioritized intimidation over defensive positioning, making them vulnerable to surgical strikes. Dr. Amy Foster had been analyzing the alien communications for hours and reported that their language contained no words for concepts like compromise, negotiation, or mutual benefit, which suggested they might be psychologically incapable of peaceful relations. Navigation Officer Paul Rodriguez calculated that they were outnumbered more than 200 to 1 and completely surrounded with no clear escape route if the situation deteriorated into open warfare. Morrison looked around the table at his officers and realized they were facing a decision that would echo through history, because humanity had never encountered aliens before, and their response would set the precedent for all. Future contact, the aliens had attacked them twice, without provocation, and seemed confused by their defensive capabilities. But Morrison was reluctant to respond with violence, unless absolutely necessary, because it might trigger a larger conflict. Kane suggested they could demonstrate human offensive capabilities by targeting a small portion of one alien ship to show they had the ability to fight back without actually killing anyone or destroying entire vessels. Brooks agreed and proposed targeting the weapon systems of the nearest dreadnought, which would disable their offensive capabilities while leaving the ship and crew intact to show human intentions were defensive rather than aggressive. Price worried that any military action might be interpreted as an act of war by a civilization that seemed to view all interactions in terms of conquest and submission rather than negotiation between equals. Foster pointed out that the aliens appeared to respect strength above all else and suggested that demonstrating human capabilities might actually open the door for diplomatic discussions rather than closing it. Rodriguez noted that their quantum torpedoes could move at near light speed, making them virtually impossible for the alien sensors to intercept or defend against, which would ensure their demonstration would be successful. Morrison weighed all the options and decided they needed to show the aliens that humans could defend themselves, while making it clear they preferred peaceful solutions to military ones. He ordered Brooks to prepare a single quantum torpedo and target only the weapons array of the closest Imperial dreadnought, while avoiding any areas that might contain crew quarters or critical life support systems. Kane began modifying the torpedo to reduce its explosive yield, so it would disable rather than destroy the alien weapons, while Brooks calculated the precise targeting data needed for such a surgical strike. The quantum torpedo launched from the Defiance, moving so fast that Imperial sensors barely detected it before impact, and when it struck the alien dreadnought, the explosion was contained entirely within the weapons bay. Every plasma cannon on the massive ship went offline simultaneously, but the vessel remained intact and operational, with its crew unharmed and its life support systems functioning normally. Admiral Zethker watched his flagship lose all offensive capability in a single instant and realized he was dealing with aliens who possessed weapons technology far beyond anything the Empire had encountered. Surgical precision of the human attack was perhaps more terrifying than if they had simply destroyed his ship, because it demonstrated a level of technological control that suggested they could have killed everyone aboard if they had chosen to. Communications throughout the Imperial fleet erupted in panic as ship commanders realized they were facing enemies who could disable their vessels at will, while remaining completely invulnerable to Imperial weapons. Price immediately opened a new communication channel addressing the entire alien fleet and explaining that humanity sought peaceful contact and scientific exchange, but would defend itself if attacked. Her message emphasized that the torpedo strike had been carefully controlled to avoid casualties and demonstrated human preference for disabling rather than destroying enemy forces whenever possible. Carter monitored alien communications and reported that many ship commanders were requesting permission to withdraw, while others were demanding immediate reinforcements from Imperial command. Foster detected increasing references to something the aliens called the doctrine of inevitable conquest, which appeared to be the philosophical foundation of their entire civilization. The doctrine stated that all species were either conquerors or conquered, and there was no middle ground for coexistence between civilizations of equal strength. Rodriguez noticed that some Imperial ships were beginning to break formation as individual commanders struggled with orders that seemed increasingly pointless given their inability to damage the human vessel. Brooks kept their remaining weapons ready, but powered down to show they had no aggressive intentions, while monitoring alien ships for signs they might attempt another coordinated attack. Kane reported that their defensive systems were operating at peak efficiency, and they could probably withstand several more bombardments like the previous ones without any significant strain on their power systems. Morrison realized they had reached a critical juncture where the aliens would either accept human proposals for peaceful coexistence or escalate the conflict by calling for reinforcements. Price crafted another diplomatic message explaining human history and how their species had learned to resolve conflicts through negotiation rather than warfare after centuries of fighting each other. Transmission included detailed information about democratic governments, individual rights, and the scientific method, along with examples of how cooperation between different human cultures had led to technological and social advances. Foster added anthropological data about human psychology and sociology to help the aliens understand why humans preferred negotiation over conquest and how their society had evolved. Beyond simple hierarchical structures, Carter detected encrypted communications between some Imperial ships and realized that not all alien commanders were united in their response to the human presence. Several younger officers seemed to be questioning their orders while others remained loyal to Imperial doctrine and demanded immediate military action against the human vessel. Brooks identified which alien ships seemed most likely to break ranks and suggested they might be potential allies if the situation deteriorated into civil conflict within the Imperial fleet. Morrison watched the alien fleet struggle with concepts that challenged their entire worldview and realized that humanity had inadvertently triggered a philosophical crisis that might reshape their civilization. The Defiance continued floating peacefully in the center of the Imperial formation, while alien commanders debated whether to retreat, call for reinforcements, or attempt another futile attack against human defenses. Morrison knew they had demonstrated human capabilities, but now faced the more difficult challenge of convincing a warrior culture that cooperation was preferable to conquest. Time was running out because eventually the aliens would either accept human proposals or escalate the conflict to a level where peaceful resolution might become impossible. Admiral Zethker paced the command deck of his disabled flagship, knowing that his career, and probably his life, depended on how he handled this unprecedented situation, because the Empire had never encountered a species that could resist their military power. He had sent an emergency subspace transmission to Imperial Command, explaining that his fleet had encountered aliens with advanced defensive technology and requesting immediate reinforcements, but he knew that admitting failure would have serious consequences. The response came faster than expected, and Zethker felt his blood freeze when he learned that Grand Admiral Vexter himself was en route with the Imperial First Fleet, which included over 1,000 ships and experimental weapons that had never been used in combat. Vexter was known throughout the Empire as the most ruthless commander who had personally overseen the destruction of dozens of rebellious worlds, and his arrival meant that Imperial Command was taking the human threat very seriously. Back on the Defiance, Navigation Officer Rodriguez detected massive subspace distortions, indicating that something enormous was approaching their position, and his instruments showed energy signatures unlike anything in their database. Captain Morrison studied the sensor readings and realized they were about to face odds of more than 1,000 to 1 against aliens who seemed determined to destroy them rather than negotiate. Chief Engineer Kane ran diagnostics on all their systems and reported that while their defenses had held against the previous attacks, they had never been tested against the kind of massive firepower that Rodriguez was detecting. Tactical Officer Brooks calculated that even their advanced shielding technology would eventually fail if subjected to sustained bombardment from 1,000 alien warships firing simultaneously. Amy Foster continued analyzing Imperial communications and made a disturbing discovery about the true scope of the civilization they were facing, which controlled over 10,000 star systems and had never been defeated in battle. Commander Price realized that retreat might be their only option, but Morrison was reluctant to abandon first contact with an alien species, even if it meant risking his ship and crew. Kane proposed a desperate plan that involved using their quantum drive to create a localized space-time distortion that could trap the Imperial fleet in a temporal bubble while the Defiance escaped. The process would require channeling their entire power grid through systems that had never been designed for such stress, and the risk of catastrophic failure was extremely high. Rodriguez calculated the coordinates needed for the quantum distortion, but warned that one miscalculation could tear a hole in space-time itself, with consequences that were impossible to predict. Brooks suggested they could use their remaining quantum torpedoes to disable as many Imperial ships as possible before attempting the escape, but Morrison wanted to avoid unnecessary casualties. Foster made another troubling discovery while monitoring alien communications and learned that the Empire maintained control over subject species through fear and brutal suppression of any resistance. Carter intercepted several encrypted transmissions from Imperial ship commanders, seemed to be discussing something other than military tactics, and the translation computers were struggling with the coded language. Price worked to decode the secret messages and realized that some Imperial officers were actually reaching out to the humans, offering to defect if they could guarantee safe passage away from the Empire. The potential defectors explained that the Empire ruled through terror, and many officers secretly questioned the doctrine of inevitable conquest, but had never dared to voice their doubts until now. Morrison faced an impossible decision, because accepting defectors could be seen as an act of war that would eliminate any chance of peaceful resolution with the Empire. However, refusing to help officers who wanted freedom would condemn them to certain death when their superiors discovered their communications with the human ship. Kane completed her calculations for the quantum distortion and reported that they would have perhaps one chance to escape before Grand Admiral Vexter arrived with overwhelming force. Brooks identified 12 Imperial ships whose commanders had sent defection requests and noted that their vessels were slowly moving away from the main formation as if preparing to break ranks. Foster warned that the Empire had built their entire civilization around conquest and slavery and might be psychologically incapable of accepting peaceful coexistence with an equal power price. Argued that helping the defectors could be the beginning of an internal revolution that might transform Imperial society from within and eliminate the threat to humanity. Rodriguez detected the leading edge of the incoming Imperial fleet and estimated they had less than 6 hours before Grand Admiral Vexter arrived with enough firepower to destroy entire solar systems. Morrison called another emergency meeting with his senior staff, knowing that whatever decision they made in the next few hours would determine the fate of both humanity and the potential alien defectors. The captain looked around the conference table at officers who had volunteered for this mission, knowing they might never see Earth again and now face choices that could trigger an interstellar war. Kane explained that the quantum distortion would only work once, and if it failed, they would be completely helpless against the incoming Imperial fleet with no chance of escape or survival. Brooks calculated that they could probably disable most of the defector ships' weapon systems to make them appear loyal to the Empire while secretly helping them escape. Foster suggested they could share some human technology with the defectors to give them a chance of surviving in exile, while also demonstrating the benefits of cooperation over conquest. Price proposed sending a final diplomatic message to the Imperial fleet, explaining human intentions and offering one last chance for peaceful resolution before the situation escalated beyond control. Carter reported that more Imperial officers were sending secret messages expressing interest in defection, but many were afraid to act because discovery would mean death for them and their families. Morrison realized they were witnessing the beginning of cracks in an empire that had ruled through fear for thousands of years, and their presence had somehow triggered doubts that had been suppressed for generations. The approaching Imperial fleet represented not just a military threat, but the last chance for the old order to maintain control over a civilization that was beginning to question its fundamental beliefs. Morrison knew that helping the defectors would mean taking sides in what could become a galactic civil war, but abandoning them would betray the human values of freedom and individual choice. Time was running out, and every minute brought Grand Admiral Vexter closer to a confrontation that could determine whether the galaxy would continue under Imperial rule or begin a new era of cooperation between free civilizations. The Defiance floated in space, surrounded by hundreds of alien warships, while its crew prepared for a decision that would reshape the political landscape of the entire galaxy. Morrison stood on the bridge, watching the stars, and knowing that the next few hours would test everything humanity believed about justice, freedom, and the right of all intelligent beings to choose their own destiny. Grand Admiral Vexter arrived in the Kronos sector with the most powerful fleet the Galactic Empire had ever assembled, including 1,200 warships, massive siege vessels designed to crack planets, and experimental weapons that could theoretically destroy entire star systems. His flagship was a monstrous dreadnought 20 kilometers long, with enough firepower to reduce a moon to dust, and he had never encountered a military problem that could not be solved with overwhelming force and absolute brutality. The Grand Admiral took one look at the tactical situation and immediately dismissed the small human vessel as an insignificant threat that had somehow confused Admiral Zethker. With primitive tricks or illusions, he opened communications with the Defiance and delivered an ultimatum that had worked on every species the Empire had ever encountered, demanding immediate surrender within 10 minutes or complete annihilation. Captain Morrison stood on the bridge of his ship, surrounded by alien warships stretching to the horizon in every direction, and knew that humanity was facing its greatest test since leaving Earth. Chief Engineer Kane reported that their quantum drive modifications were complete but completely untested, and they might escape, create a catastrophic explosion, or accidentally tear a hole in space-time itself. The risks were beyond calculation, but Morrison realized they had run out of conventional options and would have to choose between an impossible escape attempt or certain destruction. Tactical Officer Brooks confirmed that their weapons were ready, and they had enough quantum torpedoes to disable dozens of Imperial ships, but against 1,200 enemies, their offensive capabilities were meaningless. Star Amy Foster monitored the communications from the potential defectors and realized that nearly 50 Imperial commanders were secretly hoping the humans would somehow survive and offer them an alternative to serving the Empire commander. Price had prepared what might be humanity's final diplomatic message, but Morrison was not ready to give up on peaceful resolution, even when facing impossible odds. Navigation Officer Rodriguez calculated escape vectors and reported that even if their quantum distortion worked, they would probably only save themselves while abandoning the defectors to certain death. Morrison made a decision that surprised everyone, including his own crew, by ordering all weapon systems powered down and preparing to broadcast a general transmission to both the Imperial fleet and the scattered defector ships. He told Price to open a channel to every ship in the sector, because he had decided that humanity would make one final attempt at diplomacy, even when facing annihilation. The captain began his message by explaining that humans had only recently discovered faster than light travel and had come to the stars, seeking knowledge, friendship, and peaceful cooperation with other intelligent species. Described Earth history and how humanity had spent millennia fighting wars before finally learning that cooperation and mutual respect were stronger than conquest and domination. Morrison offered to share human technology freely with any civilization committed to peace, including medical advances that could cure diseases and agricultural improvements that could end hunger. Then he delivered the revelation that changed everything by explaining that the Defiance was not alone and humanity had built 50 similar ships, all exploring different regions of the galaxy. If his ship did not return safely, those other vessels would warn Earth about the Imperial threat, and humanity would respond with everything they had to protect their freedom. And the freedom of their allies. Grand Admiral Vexter laughed at what he assumed was an obvious bluff, because no primitive species could possibly threaten an empire that had conquered 10,000 star systems. He ordered every weapon in his fleet to fire simultaneously, confident that even alien technology could not withstand the combined firepower of 1,200 warships attacking at once. Energy discharge was visible from neighboring star systems as plasma beams, missile strikes, and exotic weapons converged on the small human vessel, creating an explosion equivalent to a supernova. When the light faded and space cleared, the Defiance remained completely intact, floating peacefully, as if nothing had happened, while its shields continued operating without any sign of strain. But Morrison's response shocked both fleets more than their survival, because instead of retaliating, he broadcast the complete technical specifications for human medical technology, including cures for genetic diseases that had plagued Imperial species for thousands of years. Defector ships immediately broke formation and requested asylum with the human vessel, while several loyal Imperial commanders began questioning orders as they realized their government had been withholding life-saving technology from their own people. Vexter watched in horror as his fleet began to fracture, with some ships moving toward the humans, others demanding explanations for suppressed medical knowledge, and young officers openly questioning Imperial doctrine. Rigid hierarchy that had maintained Imperial control for millennia was cracking under the weight of revealed possibilities, as commanders realized they had been serving a system that valued conquest over the welfare of its own citizens. Morrison made his final offer, broadcasting to every ship in the sector and explaining that humanity offered peaceful coexistence and technology, sharing with all species willing to abandon conquest in favor of cooperation. Those who chose war would discover that humans, despite preferring peace, were exceptionally capable of defending themselves and their allies using technology that made Imperial weapons look like primitive clubs. The first Imperial commander to openly defect was Captain Kalara of the light cruiser Vengeance, who announced that she would rather die free than live as a slave to a system that suppressed knowledge that could save lives. Within hours, dozens of other ships followed her example as word spread throughout the fleet about human medical technology and the possibility of a society based on cooperation rather than fear. Foster monitored the communications and reported that the defection was spreading beyond the immediate fleet as news of human technology reached other Imperial forces throughout the sector. Vexter found himself commanding a fleet that was dissolving before his eyes as centuries of suppressed doubts and resentments finally found expression in open rebellion against Imperial authority. The Grand Admiral realized that destroying the human ship would no longer solve his problem, because the idea of peaceful coexistence had already taken root in minds that had never conceived of alternatives to conquest. Morrison watched the beginning of a galactic revolution unfold around his ship as Imperial officers chose freedom over servitude and cooperation over domination. Defector ships formed a protective formation around the Defiance, while loyal Imperial forces found themselves increasingly isolated and outnumbered by their former comrades, began coordinating with the rebel commanders to establish the framework for a new alliance based on democratic principles and mutual respect. Rather than hierarchy and fear, Kane shared human engineering data with defector ships, helping them modify their systems for independent operation without Imperial command codes or surveillance. Technology Brooks worked with rebel tactical officers to develop defensive strategies that would protect the growing alliance from potential Imperial retaliation while avoiding unnecessary casualties. Transformation was not limited to military vessels, as civilian populations throughout Imperial space began demanding access to human medical technology and questioning why their government had kept such advances secret. Morrison realized that humanity had accomplished something unprecedented in galactic history by defeating an empire without firing a shot, simply by offering a better alternative to conquest and oppression. The age of inevitable conquest was ending, not through military victory, but through the revolutionary idea that civilizations could choose cooperation over domination, and that strength should protect rather than exploit. Weeks later, as more imperial systems declared independence, enjoying the growing alliance, Morrison stood on his bridge, watching the birth of a new galactic civilization. The Defiance had become the flagship of an interstellar democracy where former enemies worked together as equals, sharing knowledge and resources for the benefit of all member species. Humanity had found its place among the stars, not as conquerors, but as teachers, showing that the greatest victories came from transforming enemies into friends and building something better than what came before. Galaxy was finally free to explore its potential for cooperation and growth, rather than endless cycles of conquest and oppression. And the future stretched ahead, filled with unlimited possibilities.